Seeing one's face on 3 screens makes you think that you share one of the attributes of the divinity, omnipresence. In an article published in 1950 in Tomorrow magazine and later reprinted in The Sound of Mountain Water as At Home in the Fields of the Lord, Wallace Stegner realized that, quote, I am as rich in a hometown as anyone, though I adopted my hometown as an adolescent and abandoned it as a young man. When George Stegner brought his wife and 2 sons to Salt Lake in June 1921, the population of the city was 118,000. When they left in 1937, it was 149,000. The population of the valley now is over 1.1 million and is now, in effect, wall-to-wall cities. Whereas in Stegner's time, places like Taylorsville, Sandy, Murray, Midvale, Magna, Granger, and other places were small towns. And except for the downtown area of Salt Lake, everything was graveled roads. If you went to Provo or to Evanston, Wyoming, you drove on gravel. This is an interesting picture taken from the air of Temple Square in the 1930s. You'll notice the top of the tabernacle has an arrow and a sign pointing airport. As a career Navy man, I like to tease my Air Force friends by saying that this was for the benefit of Air Force pilots who can't navigate unless they can find railroad tracks or a superhighway. But for young Wallace, the city opened new vistas. Just as he discovered sidewalks and flush toilets in Great Falls, in Salt Lake he discovered, among many other things, a large public library at South Temple and State Streets, a building which many of us remember as the Hansen Planetarium. As he said to Richard Etcheley, I went down to Montana for a couple of years and then to Salt Lake, with the result that just about the time when I think most kids are groupie and feel in junior high a kind of addiction to friends and companions, all of that security was cracked wide open. I found the public library. I didn't really find it until we got to Salt Lake, but I lived in it in Salt Lake. What young Wallace could not have foreseen was that the City of the Saints would become the setting for 3 of his novels, 4 essays, and 3 short stories. Salt Lake was to be his home for about 13 of the next 16 years, and from those years he drew upon his memories for characters, settings, and episodes. Salt Lake City of the 1920s and 30s was a far more diverse place than most people believe. Ethnically, there were significant numbers of Chinese, Japanese, Greeks, Serbs, Syrians, Lebanese, Finns, Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, African Americans, and American Indians. Ethnic conclaves could be found close to downtown: Little Lebanon, Little Syria, Plum Alley for the Chinese, Japantown and Swedetown. Religiously, there were 137 congregations and parishes of 16 different denominations. Politically, it was diverse too. There were, of course, the Democrats and Republicans, but there were also some interesting anomalies. In 1920, Parley Christensen moved leftward from the Republicans to the progressives and beyond. He ran for president of the United States on a farm labor ticket and received 250,000 votes nationally. In 1924, MP Bales, a barber, ran for mayor of Salt Lake on a communist ticket and finished 4th but received 15% of the vote. When the Stegners arrived in the City of the Saints, they first lived at a home at 1191 South 7th East, which still exists. In recapitulation, this is the home with the bullet hole in the glass door. Quote, down each side of the door, relics of some time when this had been a fairly pretentious house, went a panel of leaded panes of glass of many colors. Through a violet one just level with his eyes was a neat bullet hole. Nobody knew how it had come there. It hinted of old crimes, feuds, jealous lovers, better days. The Stegners lived in so many homes that the city directory people weren't able to keep up with them because of George's bootlegging and running of a blind pig in the family home. We know definitely of 14 addresses, but of these, only 11 still exist. Years later, when Stegner was on the University of Utah faculty, he and Mary bought a lot in the Forest Hills section to the south of Salt Lake City at about 37th South and 17th East. At that time, the home would have had a splendid 360-degree view of the valley and 3 mountain ranges. Sometime later, of course, they sold it. Wallace and his brother Cecil attended East High School at 8th South and 13th East. The school exists about 2 miles southwest of this meeting. Many of you know it as the setting for High School Musical. During their years at East, the boys took part in many student activities. Wallace was a scholar. He studied English, plain and solid geometry, zoology, ROTC, physics, chemistry, ancient history, algebra, and 3 years of Latin, all of them with high grades. Cecil, on the other hand, was a singer and the athlete, a football quarterback, a baseball pitcher, a singer in operettas, but not much of a scholar. Wallace used his high school years for scenes in recapitulation and a short story. In both the novel and the volunteer, he uses his experiences in the Latin class of Marion von Pelt to develop the incident regarding the building of a Roman fort. And in recapitulation, there's the memorable incident at Fort Douglas, a few yards to the north of this hotel, when Bruce Mason struggles through a summer with the Citizens Military Training Group, in which he suffers a number of self-inflicted indignities and a nearly fatal accident with a .45 caliber automatic on the pistol range. In the Big Rock Candy Mountain, Chet, or Cecil, recalls a lunchroom just across the street to the north of the high school where the LDS seminary now stands. He calls the place Mad Maisie's, but well into the 1930s, as one of my relatives recalls, the students called it Marijuana Mary's for its alleged selling of the weed. A passage in recapitulation probably recalls Wallace's own teenage years in Salt Lake as Bruce Mason walks down South Temple toward the funeral home. He realizes, quote, Bruce Mason walked double. Inside him, walking with the same muscles and feeling with the same nerves and sweating through the same pores, when a thin brown youth, volatile, impulsive, never at rest, not so much a person as a possibility, a bundle of possibilities, subject to enthusiasm and elation and exuberance and occasional black moods, stubborn, capable of scheming, but often astonished by consequences. A boy vulnerable to wonder, awe, worship, devotion, hatred, guilt, vanity, shame, ambition, dreams, treachery. A boy avid for acceptance and distinction, secretive and a blabbermouth, life crazy and hence girl crazy. A show-off who could be withered by a contemptuous word or look, a creature overflowing with brash self-confidence one minute and oppressed by its own worthlessness the next, a vessel of primary sensations undiluted by experience, wisdom, or fatigue. Boy, that describes my own teenage years. It was also in high school that he discovered tennis, a sport that would earn him 3 letters at the university, with his friends Jack Irvine and David Freed. Throughout his youth, Wallace was also fascinated with the Salt Lake Bees baseball team. And these are the graduation pictures of Wallace and Cecil. Throughout his youth, Wallace was also fascinated with the Salt Lake Bees, some of whom were patrons of George's living room speakeasy, players like Willie Cam, Lefty O'Doul, Duffy Lewis, Paul Strand, and Tony Lazzari. Lazzari, who hit a long-standing minor league record, 60 home runs with the Bees in 1925 before he became the 3rd member of the famous Yankees murderers row of Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and Tony Lazzari. Wallace remembered, Quote, the year Tony Lazzari hit 60 home runs over the short left field fence at Bonneville Park, I haunted State Street outside that fence and risked death 100 times in traffic to chase batting practice balls and get a free seat in the left field bleachers. Bonneville Park was located at between 8th and 9th South on State Street, where the present Sears store stands. And at one time, Fritz Kowambe gave him a left-handed first baseman's mitt that had belonged to the legendary George Sisler. And for one summer, he sold hot dogs at Salt Air, the famous pleasure palace, 18 miles west of the city on the shores of the Great Salt Lake, which serves as the setting for the hilariously comic scene in which Bruce Mason pinches the girl in the tight red dress and then has to run for his life all the way home. My colleague, the late Everett Cooley, the historian, a friend of Wally, asked him one day, Wally, you know that incident in Recapitulation, the girl in the red dress? Did you do that? And Wallace reportedly lowered his eyes and very softly said, yeah. But the wonderful description, the wonderful evocation of Salt Air. Quote, the breeze that sweeps through the wall-less pavilion brings in Midway Sounds, nasal chanting of barkers, thunder of the roller coaster with its obligato of squeals, shuffling of many feet, cries and mutterings, the rumble and twitter of voices, and Midway odors, taffy, popcorn, candy, rancid grease from the hot dog and hamburger stands, and the encompassing smell of the salt flats. The shore breeze blows them into the pavilion and through the tables and across the dance floor and through the unused tables on the other side, picking up in passing all the dining room odors of roast beef, barbecue sauce, spare ribs, coffee, vinegar, floor wax, a sudden sourceless onion smell of female perspiration, and an equally sudden whiff of perfume. There's a famous passage in Xanadu by the Salt Flats in which he talks about Salt Air, about trying to teach his grandchildren how to roast their hot dogs. It's too long a passage for me to read here, but when you look at Xanadu by the Salt Flats, you'll encounter it. This is another picture of Salt Air in the time, and I like that sign above Orrin Sweetman's band, The Den of Iniquity. After graduating from East in 1925, Wallace moved on to the University of Utah. Established on February 28, 1850, as the University of Deseret. In the late 1920s, the university had a student body of 3,000. Now we've got about 29,000. And get this, a quarterly tuition of $13 and a budget of $800,000. For the 16-year-old, it was a new world. As he tells us, it is the love of books I owe them. Quote, despite some things that too well remembered might persuade me otherwise, I think those years between 1925 and 1930, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Utah, were the happiest time in my life, certainly the happiest up to that point. Not even the censorious desk sergeant who books my dreams can distort the pleasant images I retain. I came as a 16-year-old into an expanding universe, and for a while expanded with it. He majored in English, played on the freshman basketball team, and for 3 years on the tennis team, and wrote for and later edited the Penn Literary Magazine. He was a member and president of the Sigma Nu, was a member of the Sigma Nu fraternity and was president of the Sigma Epsilon literary fraternity, of which he was president. He came, there he is in the upper left as president. He soon came to work closely with faculty members who remained friends for many years, Sidney Engelman, Edward Chapman, and L.A. Quivy. But his introduction to college life must have been a shock when, quote, Vardis Fisher, my freshman English instructor, announced on the first day that he intended to take a can opener to our minds. He had the notion we were all Mormon provincials, that we'd never seen anything, and that a real idea would scare the pants off us. Many of his fellow students later made their own mark in the world. Gordon B. Hinckley, president of the LDS Church. J. Willard Marriott, founder of the Hot Shops and the Marriott Hotels. O.C. Tanner, the educator, businessman and philanthropist. Phyllis McGinley, who won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry and became the first University of Utah student to win a Pulitzer Prize. Phyllis McGinley, Wallace Stegner, Bernard DeVoto, but DeVoto spent only 1 year here, and then eventually Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. There was also David Freed, Wallace's varsity tennis teammate, and later captain of the American Davis Cup team. Reva Beck Bassoni, who was Utah's first congresswoman, and then 2 future chief justices of the Utah Supreme Court. The essay, "It is the love of books I owe them," and much of recapitulation involves Stegner's memories of his undergraduate years at the university. The essay evokes the ambiance of the campus in the late 1920s. Quote, "For all its easygoing atmosphere, and despite all my apparent effort to avoid contamination by ideas, the university did reach me. It reached me early, and it continued to reach me, often when I didn't realize it was doing so. From the first day of classes, I met teachers who influenced and excited me. World famous, most of them were not or ever would be. But they were teachers, and they taught in a friendly environment. Many of them were still there to become my colleagues when I returned to teach after some years in graduate school. Some of them are still here and still among my closest friends after half a century. Among them were people like Engelman, with whom Stegner visited and corresponded until Sid's death in the spring of 1971, L.A. Quivy and Edward Chapman, all of whom Stegner read papers for. Among his favorites was Sherman Neff Brown, all of whom, head of the department during Stegner's years at the university, who, quote, had a rather old-fashioned way of teaching poetry. He read it aloud. The result for me was that he filled my head with stanzas and lines and passages. Like Sid Engelman and Edward Chapman, he was a lover of what he taught. And I love this. Not one of that more recent tribe who infest the English departments and do their best to make students feel superior to what they read. I wonder what Wallace would have thought if he had been on the University of Utah campus when in the English department we had a guest lecturer who spoke on the topic, "Mother, do you have a wee-wee maker too?" Subtitled, "Freud's Representations of Female Sexuality in the Case of Little Hans." But the students at the U could also have a good time. The Utonian during those years contained a humor section which played fast and loose with every phase of university life. If you can imagine the president of the student body having his head in a picture taken off and mounted on top of a young lady in a garter belt and brassiere, I don't think you can get away with that now. We read that Stegner's fraternity brothers were known as Sigma-nuers, and that Juanita Crawford's sorority, Lambda Phi Lambda, had as its motto, "Love fat ladies." And a fictional co-ed named Lavina Dingbat can complain. I thought dingbat was a relatively recent term, but this is from 1928. "I was an ardent seeker of culture. As a consequence, I was exposed to lectures on enzymes, streptococci, chiropractic, ethnography, spontaneous generation, osteopathy, Fletcherism, spiritualism, and the New Thought. Professors assailed me with Greek, Latin, German, French, Italian, cuneiform script, hieroglyphics, the signs of the Magi, and the formulae of the English department." After 4 years, I received a degree cum laude and married a Ford salesman. The faculty, too, is not given any quarter, being pictured as, quote, a group of thugs, a bunch of enjoyment murderers hired by the state, end quote, who expect students to come to class, stay awake, and listen to lectures that, quote, strangle the classics and get tangled up in the events of bygone days, end quote. And there were moments recalled in nostalgia. The popular song sung in the evening by his college and high school friends, particularly his college friends, just a short ways from here at 12th East, just below 13th East, where the fraternity house still stands. It's the Sigma Nu fraternity house has been remodeled, and the exterior is a little bit different, but still recognizable. But he tells us, because I believe in the influence of places on personalities, I think it's somehow important that certain songs we sang as high school or college students in the 20s still mean particular and personal things. I'm looking over a four-leaf clover is all tied up with the late dusk smell of October on 2nd South and 12th East, and the shine of the arc lights on the split streets tipping up 2nd South Hill. When day is done, has all the linseed oil smell of yellow slickers on it. Exactly like you means the carpet, the mezzanine, the very look and texture and smell of the Temple Square Hotel. He also remembers the old Deseret Gymnasium, same block as the Hotel Utah, where he played freshman basketball for the university. Quote, I hit all the high school gyms as well as the rickety old Deseret Gymnasium next to the Hotel Utah, where cockroaches as big and as dangerous as roller skates might be stepped on behind the dark lockers. For his years at the university, Stegner was grateful. At the end of this essay, he says that, quote, it is ultimately the love of books I owe them. As an organism, I have outlived nearly all those who taught me most, but their influence still works in me, and I am grateful for the warmth and openness of their friendship. As my tennis and basketball playing friends ushered me into the human world and taught me how to belong, this handful of teacher friends introduced me to the life of the mind where, even though I didn't know it then, I most wanted to live. No university, even the greatest, could have done much more. But the university also provided him with a rich load of material for his fiction, most notably the novel Recapitulation. In Recapitulation, there are 4 characters who are based upon some of Stegner's closest friends at the university. Joe Mulder, Nola Gordon, Holly, who's never given a surname, and Jack Bailey. Joe Mulder was based upon Jack Irvine, the son of the co-owner of I&M Rug and Linoleum at 251 South State, where Wallace worked during his college years as a salesman and a delivery driver. Throughout Recapitulation, Joe is the unfailing friend of Bruce Mason, teaching him how to play tennis and serving as his constant companion. He became one of Utah's best-known antique dealers, died in 1987 and is buried in Salt Lake City's Wasatch Lawn Cemetery. His son, Robert Irvine, is a novelist living in Carmel, California. And Jack Irvine is at the left and Stegner at the right. Nola Gordon was drawn from Wallace's fiancée, Juanita Crawford, a young lady and classmate from Heron, Utah, whose daughter is Ann Riordan, professor of emeritus of modern dance at the University of Utah. And perhaps Ann is in the audience. I guess not. A gracious and wonderful and talented lady. Returning to Salt Lake City after 45 years, Bruce remembers her. Nola in a party dress of green taffeta, her hair piled rich and dark on her head, her orchid pinned to her waist, her shoulders rising bare out of the stiff green silk are smooth and golden. She is as full of promise as the spring night outside. She is not made for acrobatics or showing off. She is made for waltzes, slow foxtrots, circlings in uncrowded corners, long looks, murmured talk, serious questions, sober moments, upward smiles, communion. Her voice is husky, her laugh so warm and low that it makes the laughter of other girls sound like the cackling of hens. Bruce asks himself, how did a girl from a cow town on the edge of the slick rock country, how did such a girl from such a starving and primitive little town get born with perfect pitch and the ability to play almost any instrument after a try or two by ear? Where did she sing? Where did she learn so well to sing parts in her husky contralto? Singing, she was a warm and happy energy. Joy came out of her mouth. She died on September 9th, 1974. She's buried in the northwest part of the Salt Lake Cemetery, ironically only about 200 feet or so from the Stegner plot. Holly was drawn from Helen or Peg Foster, who later went to China, met and married the famous journalist Edgar Snow, the man who wrote the books on communist China, most notably Red Star over China. Died in 1997 at the age of 89 and is buried in Connecticut. Her papers are in the Harold B. Lee Library at Brigham Young University in Provo. Holly, he remembers as being surrounded by, quote, painters of bile green landscapes, cubist photographers, poets and iconoclasts, resident dadaists, scorners of the bourgeoisie, makers of cherished prose, dream tellers, correspondence school psychoanalysts who swarmed through Holly's apartment and eddied about her queenly shape with noises like breaking china. He remembered her in a gold gown, a Proserpine or a Circe. For an instant she was slim and tall in his mind, and he saw her laughing in the midst of the excitement she created, and how her hair was smooth and black, and her eyes very dark blue, and how she wore. Have I lost a page? Oh, good grief. Well, I have. I'll have to wing it. He describes her as being a beautiful lady, a woman who lived above the neck, in other words, the intellectual or the pseudo-intellectual, and Nola, on the other hand, is living below the neck. That is a woman who is more interested in the romantic and the beautiful things of life. And then he tells Holly that he and Nola are going to be engaged, and Holly can't believe it. She almost bursts out laughing. And at this point, Bruce Mason says that Holly's voice was like vanilla. Nola's was like caramel or chocolate. Well, let's see, where do I go from here now? Okay. But Salt Lake City was a place from which Stegner drew both pleasant and bad memories. He says, from its founding, Salt Lake has been a sanctuary, and it is a sanctuary that it persists even in my Gentile mind and insinuates itself as my veritable hometown. Yet there are darker and more ambiguous associations attached to it, and it is strange to me returning to find myself looking upon Salt Lake as the place of my security. And now I have to back up. I know what I was going to do. The third novel is Joe Hill, originally published as The Preacher and the Slave in 1950, dealing with the murder by Joe Hill, a later labor antagonist, of a grocer and his son, the Morrisons, at 768 South 3rd West. Hill was later executed in 1917. And he was executed at the old Utah prison in Sugar House. And there it was. These dark associations have to do with the deaths of his brother in 1931 and his mother in 1933. And in that connection, I'd like to recommend that you read the letter Much Too Late that he wrote to his mother 50 years after her death. It's hard to read that letter, no matter how callous you may be, with some choking up. And he also remembers the suicide of his father and his father's murder of Dorothy Webb Leroy on June 15th, 1939. And this is the Hotel Heron. If you know Salt Lake, it's just east of State Street on 2nd South, and it's on the south side of the street where the Bank of the West now stands. Early in the same essay, however, you can see the other side of the coin. In Salt Lake, I wrote my first short story and my first novel. In Salt Lake, I fell in love for the first time and was rudely jilted for the first time and recovered for the first time. In Salt Lake, I took my first drink and acquired a delightful familiarity with certain speakeasies that I could find now blindfold if there were any necessity. I experimented with ether beer and peach brandy and bathtub gin and survived them all, as I survived the experience of driving an automobile at 16 or 17 by hairbreadth but satisfactory margins. I surged up and down across the New Jerusalem from Murray to Beck's Hot Springs and from Salt Air to Brighton and Pinecrest. And how it was, its weathers and its lights is very clear to me. Thus the writer, humanist, and conservationist who came to a strange new city at age 12 and left it at 28 to return only for visits, has left us with a memorable evocation of Salt Lake City in the 1920s and 30s. In the end, he remarks, "Whether it is with the Anglo-Saxon poet that I have borne, this can I bear also, or whether it says, there I lived life to the hilt, and so let come what may, my hometown, late discovered, is not a deprivation or a loss or a yearning backward. I recently had the experience of recognizing, and with pleasure, what the city meant to me, but I was not heartbroken to leave either it or that youth of mine that it embalms. There is only this solid sense of having had, or having been, or having lived these things. I can never lose them again." And so one of the 20th century's greatest writers, who remembered himself as, quote, a Gentile in the New Jerusalem, or, quote, resident of a, quote, residual frontier town, eventually came to realize, as he says at the end of At Home in the Fields of the Lord, home is what you can take away with you. Thank you. Yes?
A comment. You really evoked the whole feeling where my father and mother went to school and how much I love that book and this author. And thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Can you restate the question, please?
It was a comment.
It was just a comment saying how much she and her, was it your father, your parents?
And my grandfather and my son.
Okay, ancestors enjoyed Stegner because it evoked so much of the period. And that thing about the lunch counter north of East High School, this relative who told me that it was called Marijuana Mary's said that in those days, East High School was pretty evenly divided between the very rich and the very poor. And one noon he went over there, and he was from a poor family, and this rich kid came in and proceeded to insult the woman who was named Mary, who ran the place. And she signaled to him and to Richard to come back. She took them back in the back room, and she opened up this drawer, which was just jammed with greenbacks. So I think she had been selling something more than hot dogs. Other comments or questions? Yes.
You mentioned he wrote the novel about Joe Hill, and in that novel, he's very well convinced that Joe Hill actually committed the murder, whereas in labor organizing lore and so on, Joe Hill was portrayed as an innocent person who was executed. What's your take?
What's my take?
Yeah.
I don't know. Having read the novel, and having read, who did the doctoral dissertation at Gibbs Smith. I think Joe Hill was probably guilty. But I've been told that Wallace paid a heavy price for that he received a lot of threats and insulting letters and things ever afterward because Joe Hill was kind of the patron saint of the labor movement in Utah in the early part of the 20th century. Yes?
As a professor, I'm interested in your comment on how students today react to the writings of Wallace Stegner, and what do you think they take away from it about the history of our place and the history of our times here?
Thank you. I taught an individual authors course at the University of Utah for 8 years on Wallace Stegner, and every time I offered it, the class was at room capacity. And it was a good feeling to see these youngsters who knew very little about Stegner really, to use the expression, cotton to him. They found so much in his experiences as a student that they could relate to. They saw that, like all the great writers, he dealt with the problems that human beings face day to day. And they loved him. And it was in the first time that I taught the course that on a Monday morning a student came in with a clipping from the Salt Lake Tribune telling about the accident in Santa Fe. Immediately, one of the students after class went over to the bookstore and got a big postcard, blank card with a wonderful scene of quaking aspens on the cover. All the students signed it with beautiful comments and sent it to Santa Fe. And as for me, well, Stegner kind of served as the beginning and the terminus of my career. I was teaching at Augustana College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the real Augustana, not that jock factory in Rock Island. And the head of the department was Don Frixell, who had been a student of Stegner's at Augustana. And embedded in the freshman reader was Remembering Laughter. It was the first novel that I ever taught in college. And a few days before my retirement in 2001, I was teaching the Stegner class as my last class, and my last lecture was to be finishing up Crossing to Safety. And so the beginning and the end of my career are involved with Wallace Stegner. Other comments or questions? Yes?
On reading your book, I was curious as to what your personal connection to Salt Lake City has been during your life.
Well, I didn't grow up in Salt Lake. I grew up in South Dakota and can share a good deal of Stegner's fascination with the prairie and Wolf Willow. Those passages about the limitless horizon and all of that. I read a paper at the Dakota Conference last spring, and I read that passage where Stegner said he went back to Iowa and he started missing the earth colors. And of course, he says, the endless green of Iowa offended me, and half the audience was from Iowa. One of my friends was a little irritated at the end. But I grew up in South Dakota and came to Utah State first. I taught 4 years up there and still love Logan, then came down here in '66 and spent 35 years in the English department, so I'm kind of a refugee from the English department. Thank you. Yes? Oh, okay. Stop.